I was heading home early from work that day, with no high expectations, just looking forward to a quiet weekend like many others. The New Jersey sky was cloudy, but inside me, there was a kind of serenity. Maybe because, despite everything, I still believed that my life was at a point of balance. It wasn't perfect, but it was stable. As I entered the front door, the familiarity of the environment enveloped me, the smell of coffee that still hung in the morning air, the pictures on the wall, the photos, everything reminded me that this was my home, the place where I should feel safe. However, something was different. There was no sound of footsteps in the house, just silence. As I walked through the room, I heard a low, muffled voice coming from the bedroom at the back. I felt a tightness in my chest. My name wasn't mentioned, but the words that followed were like a dagger piercing my confidence. She was on the phone, talking to her friend. "I don't want him to find out about the betrayal," she said, her voice full of nervousness. That froze time. For a moment, everything around me lost meaning. It was as if the ground had been ripped out from under my feet, and I was falling into an endless abyss. The air became thick, difficult to breathe, and my thoughts collided between anger and disbelief. Betrayal. She had betrayed me. Without me realizing it, the love I thought we had was rotting inside. I backed away from the door before she could see me. I returned to the living room, where smiling photos of the two of us stared back at me, ironic, like silent witnesses to a love that no longer existed. I took a deep breath. The impact of what I had just heard reverberated within me. I wanted to scream, explode, confront her immediately, but I didn't. My mind, instead of giving in to fury, began to work in another way, colder, more calculated. Organizing the divorce was the first thought that came to mind. In the days that followed, I pretended nothing had happened. And she acted like everything was normal, smiling at me in the morning, kissing me on the forehead before leaving. Inside, all I could think about was how to get revenge, how to expose his betrayal in the most devastating way possible. I began to watch his steps carefully. It wasn't just the phone call that condemned her, but small signs that now became clear, evident like the treacherous shine of a knife about to cut. She had been more distant for months, and I, naively, believed it was just the weight of routine. But now, it all made sense. The constant text messages, the hidden smiles while looking at your phone. Deep down, I knew there was another man, but I still didn't have the confirmation I needed. Every time she went out to meet a friend or shop, I knew she was lying. But before I acted, I wanted to know the extent of this betrayal. How far had she sunk into this hole of lies? I followed in his footsteps for a few days. And it was on one of those nights, when I said I was going out for dinner with a friend, that I decided to go ahead. I saw her enter a restaurant, her hands shaking as she walked through the door. It didn't take long for him to appear. A well-dressed man, too confident for my taste. He greeted her with a kiss on the cheek, and then they sat down. Betrayal wasn't just a vague idea. She was there, alive, pulsating, in front of my eyes. Every gesture, every smile she exchanged with him, was like a dagger stuck deeper into my heart. It wasn't a mistake, it wasn't a simple weakness. It was something planned, premeditated. And worst of all, she looked happy. That happiness that I hadn't seen on your face in a while. I came home that night with a plan. Divorce would be the least. I didn't just want to get out of that relationship. I wanted her to feel the same level of pain and humiliation that I was feeling. But there was something else going on. I still didn't know who the man was, but I would soon find out. And when I did, the truth revealed itself even more unbearable. He was also married. The whole situation took on a new dimension. It wasn't just my wife's cheating. She was engaging in a game of destruction that affected lives other than our own. His wife, how would she react when she found out? Was she as naive as I was? Or maybe you already knew and were just waiting for the right moment to act. My nights became a pit of anguish. As my wife slept next to me, I couldn't stop thinking about everything that had happened. The way she pretended, the way she maintained the mask of a devoted wife, while, in the shadows, she was someone else. But now, I had a choice. I could confront her directly, expose her infidelity. Or I could make her suffer, slowly and painfully, just as I was suffering. And it was at that point that everything changed. A message appeared on my cell phone from an unknown number. "We need to talk." She was the wife of my wife's lover. Now, everything was about to get out of control. What was once just a discreet betrayal, hidden in the corners of a restaurant, would turn into something much bigger. The truth would be exposed, not just to me, but to everyone. I had the power to destroy not only my marriage, but hers as well. And in the midst of all this, questions began to haunt me. How far was I willing to go to get revenge? What was I willing to sacrifice? And, at the end of it all, would it be worth it? As I looked at my sleeping wife, pretending to ignore the lies that were hidden behind every smile, a single thing echoed in my mind: I don't want him to discover the betrayal. Well, now, everyone would find out. And nothing would be the same again. But there was one last piece in this game of lies and betrayal, something I hadn't yet realized. Something that would make everything even more devastating. Welcome to the channel. Here, we do not support any type of betrayal. All the stories you will hear are fictional, created to show how betrayal destroys lives, relationships, and families. Get ready, because now you're going to dive into an intense story, full of twists and turns and raw emotions. Good story, and prepare for the unexpected. The silence in the house was what bothered Mark the most lately. That same house that, years before, was always full of laughter, conversations, and the typical sounds of family life, now seemed empty, even when there was someone around. The routine, which once brought comfort, was now a silent weight, making each day more monotonous than the last. Mark was a 38-year-old man, a hard worker and apparently happy. He had built his life with care and effort, working at a technology company as an operations manager. For those who knew him, he was the example of a successful man, who managed to balance his professional and personal life. But, as he well knew, not everything was so simple. Things change. And for him, they had changed in ways he still couldn't fully understand. Mark's wife, Sarah, was everything he ever wanted. At 36 years old, she was a beautiful, intelligent woman with a striking presence. They met in college and have since built a life together. For their friends, they were the perfect couple. Married for 12 years, they shared good times, trips and plans for the future. But, little by little, something began to be lost between them. The connection that was once evident now seemed to disappear, almost imperceptibly, like sand slipping between fingers. Mark spent more time at work, while Sarah began to dedicate herself to new activities. She was always creative, someone who liked to stay busy with new projects. In recent months, however, Sarah had been involved in a digital marketing course, claiming it was to help hone the skills she already had in her small graphic design business. Mark was supportive, of course. Always supported. But he couldn't help but notice that her enthusiasm for this new phase was accompanied by a certain emotional distance, something he didn't quite know how to approach. The two still shared a bed every night, but the space between them seemed to grow every day. Mark, always attentive to details, noticed the restrained smiles, the brief answers and the conversations that never went beyond the trivial. Dinner, which used to be a moment of relaxation, was now filled with uncomfortable silences or arguments about small things, like who would forget to buy the milk or plans for the weekend. Despite this, Mark struggled to keep up appearances. In fact, he tried to believe that everything was fine. Maybe it was just a phase. Every couple goes through more difficult times, he thought. Sarah was always a busy woman, she always had her own interests, and perhaps he was exaggerating things. Who knows, with a little patience, everything could go back to normal. Sarah, for her part, seemed to be on a journey of her own, further away than ever. Although she maintained the routine of a dedicated wife, her gaze was often lost, distant, as if something was constantly occupying her mind. She got up early, often before Mark, and spent hours on the computer, immersed in projects and answering emails. For him, that was just professional dedication, something he always admired about her. But what Mark didn't know, what he didn't even suspect, was that Sarah's focus was no longer completely on work or her professional ambitions. She carried a weight, a secret, something that had been silently eating away at the fabric of the relationship they had built. Sarah didn't want things to be that way, she didn't want the marriage to become this web of silences and misunderstandings. But something inside her had changed, and she was about to make decisions that would alter the course of both their lives. There was a time when Sarah felt complete with Mark. They shared dreams, built plans for the future, and she truly believed they could grow old together happily. But the routine, the demands of adult life and the personal changes that they both faced over the years left scars that they never knew how to heal. Mark's attention always seemed divided, between work, commitments, responsibilities. And, without either of them noticing, the space between them grew imperceptibly, until it became an abyss. However, the couple's social life was still active. They attended events with mutual friends, attended dinners and weekend get-togethers. But even these moments, which were once pleasurable, now seemed like an obligation. Sarah laughed in conversations, talked to friends, but inside she felt disconnected. She watched other couples and wondered if it was still possible to get back what she once had with Mark. Maybe the problem was with her, or maybe it was just the natural course of long-term relationships. Mark, on the other hand, was beginning to question his own role in that estrangement. He found himself increasingly immersed in work, looking for new projects and challenges to fill the void that was forming at home. The extra hours at the office were often a relief from having to deal with the silences and doubts that echoed through the walls of his own home. He knew something was wrong, but he didn't know where to start fixing it. There were also moments of affection between them. Small gestures that reminded them of what they once were, a touch of hands, a hurried kiss before leaving for work. But these gestures, which were previously accompanied by meaning, now seemed automatic, without the passion they had before. The fear that this was becoming more and more common began to haunt Mark, but he forced himself to believe that it was just a bad phase. Something every couple faces. However, as the days passed, something inside Mark began to change. He didn't want to admit it to himself, but the shadow of doubt was already planted. There was something else going on, he could feel it. The details, no matter how small, were there. Sarah was smiling at him, but her eyes were empty. She talked about work plans, but never shared her feelings like before. And most of all, there was a tension in the air, something Mark couldn't name, but it was always there, like an approaching storm. It was as if an invisible wall had risen between them, and with each attempt at conversation, with each touch, he felt this wall growing stronger. Mark began to replay the last few months in his mind, looking for clues, for signs that would indicate what had gone wrong. But try as I might, I couldn't find a clear explanation. Everything seemed normal, at least on the surface. Sarah, in turn, was also trapped in her own thoughts. She knew something needed to change, that she couldn't continue living in that lie for long. But the fear of confrontation, the fear of hurting Mark, paralyzed her. She didn't want to be responsible for destroying what they had built together. But at the same time, I didn't know how to turn back. The days continued to drag on, and both of them, trapped in their own silent anguish, followed the routine as if nothing was wrong. However, deep down, they knew they were just delaying the inevitable. Something was about to change, and when it did, nothing would be the same again. What neither of them knew was that this change would come in an unexpected and devastating way, bringing to light secrets that would be impossible to hide. The next few days seemed to drag on for Mark, as if a heavy fog hung over his mind. He tried to concentrate on his work, but it was impossible to shake the growing feeling that something was terribly wrong. Every time he looked at Sarah, he felt a pang of doubt, as if the distance between them was no longer something that could be ignored. There was an unspoken tension between them, and Mark, increasingly restless, began to pay attention to the small details that had previously gone unnoticed. Sarah's meetings with her friends became more frequent, as did the long hours she spent away from home, claiming to be in meetings to expand her business. At first, Mark tried to rationalize his absences, thinking that perhaps it was his insecurity speaking louder. However, his intuition told him otherwise. With each passing day, he felt like he was being deceived, and this silent distrust began to erode his sense of security. One night, Mark decided to do something he had never done before. While Sarah was taking a shower, he took her cell phone, which was on the table. He felt a weight in his hand as he held the device, as if he knew that what he was about to discover would change his life forever. His fingers hesitated for a moment before unlocking the screen, and when he finally did, he didn't have to look far. The messages were there, visible, exchanged with a contact she had saved under a false name. The conversations were full of innuendo, filled with an affection and intimacy that he hadn't seen in his own marriage for some time. "I can't wait to see you tomorrow," one message read. "This week without you is killing me," replied another. Mark felt his heart beat faster, a mixture of shock and disbelief. He read, one after another, the messages exchanged between Sarah and a man whose name he did not yet know, but whose presence was already palpable in her life. When Sarah came out of the bathroom, wrapped in a towel, Mark had already put his cell phone back in its place. He watched her, feeling a whirlwind of emotions he could barely control. Her smile, although brief, seemed like a lie. Every gesture she made, from fixing her hair to putting on her pajamas, seemed fake, as if the woman in front of her was no longer the same one he had married. That night, as she slept next to him, Mark couldn't sleep a wink. The betrayal was now an indisputable truth, something he could no longer ignore. But instead of confronting her right away, he decided to wait. I needed to understand better, I needed to know who the man Sarah was involved with was and how far this betrayal had gone. Over the next few days, Mark began watching Sarah's movements even more closely. Every outing, every quick call, every excuse now seemed loaded with new meanings. He found himself imagining the details of the relationship between her and her lover, and it consumed him. There were moments when he wanted to scream, confront her, ask for explanations. But something inside him stopped him. It was as if he needed more proof, more certainty before acting. One night, Sarah casually mentioned that she was going out to dinner with a friend. It was the perfect excuse, and Mark knew this was the moment he had been waiting for. After seeing her leave the house, he waited a few minutes and decided to follow her. His heart was pounding in his chest as he drove through the streets, keeping a safe distance. The feeling that everything was about to fall apart was overwhelming. When Sarah parked in front of a restaurant, Mark stopped the car a little further away, watching from a distance. He saw her enter, and a few minutes later a man appeared. He was tall, well-dressed, and clearly familiar to Sarah, as he greeted her with a kiss on the cheek and a smile that, to Mark, seemed charged with intimacy. They sat at a table in the corner of the restaurant, laughing and talking as if the world around them didn't exist. For Mark, it was like watching a nightmare come to life. Here was proof of what he feared, the betrayal he had tried so hard to avoid, but which was now there, in front of him, unrelenting. He didn't know how long he watched. Minutes? Hours? Everything seemed to mix together in a confusion of feelings. Anger, sadness, humiliation. He wanted to go in, confront them, make a scene. But something stopped him. There was a part of Mark that, despite the pain, knew it wasn't time yet. He needed more, needed to understand the extent of it all. Returning to the car, Mark sat in the driver's seat, his mind spinning. The betrayal had been revealed, but there was still something he couldn't fully understand. Something about the expression on Sarah's face, about the way she looked at that man. It seemed like more than just an affair. There was something deeper, something he didn't yet know, but was about to discover. As Mark looked at the restaurant in the distance, a single certainty echoed in his mind: the truth had not yet been completely revealed. And when it was, everything he knew would change forever. Mark's mind was in a whirlwind. Night after night, he tossed and turned in bed, unable to sleep, replaying recent events. The messages he had found, the suspicious encounters, Sarah's cold lies. She slept next to him, as if nothing was wrong, as if everything was perfectly in place. But for him, everything was falling apart. It was impossible to ignore the betrayal that now haunted his thoughts. The man she was involved with wasn't just a stranger, he represented the collapse of everything Mark thought he knew. It was a Saturday morning when Mark decided he could no longer postpone the confrontation. The weight of the truth was too great to continue carrying in silence. He needed answers. He needed to know who the man was who had come into her life without permission and, more importantly, he needed to know why Sarah had chosen the path of betrayal. Sarah was in her room, working on her laptop, completely oblivious to the approaching storm. Mark entered slowly, his gaze fixed on her, his heart racing in his chest. He stood in the doorway for a moment, watching her, as if trying to memorize the image before destroying it with the truth. Then, he took a deep breath and decided to speak. "We need to talk," he said, his voice low but firm. Sarah looked up from her computer, surprised by the tone. She closed the laptop slowly, feeling something was wrong. There was something in Mark's eyes that made her uneasy. Of course. What it was? She asked, trying to maintain control, but nervousness was already beginning to appear in her expression. Mark approached the bed, crossing his arms. He was tired of beating around the bush, tired of pretending he didn't know what was going on. "I know about you and the other man," he said, with a calm that surprised even himself. "I know you're cheating on me." The silence that followed was deafening. Sarah looked at him, frozen, as if she didn't know what to say. For a moment, it looked like she was going to deny it, but Mark's eyes, fixed on her, said he already knew everything. There was no way to escape. "Mark," she began, her voice trembling. "It's not what you think, isn't that what I'm thinking?" He interrupted, with a bitter laugh. "I saw the messages, Sarah. I saw you together at that restaurant. So please explain to me what exactly I'm not understanding." Sarah looked at him, panic rising within her. She knew she had been careless, she knew Mark would find out eventually, but she wasn't prepared to face him like this. His mind raced in search of a way out, an explanation, anything that could lessen the impact of what he already knew. "I'm so sorry," she said finally, with tears in her eyes. "I didn't want things to come to this. I got lost, and I made a mistake." Mark watched as tears formed in her eyes, but instead of compassion, he felt an emptiness expanding inside him. Apologies weren't enough. They couldn't be. He shook his head in disbelief. "A mistake? Do you call months of lies and betrayal a mistake?" His voice was heavy with the hurt and anger he had suppressed for so long. "I was here, Sarah. I was always here, believing that we still had something, that our marriage was worth it. Meanwhile, you were lying to me, cheating on me with another man. Who is he?" Sarah looked down, unable to look at him. She knew there was no going back, and the only thing she could do now was tell the truth, no matter how painful it was. "His name is Jonathan," she said, her voice barely audible. He's married too." Mark was silent for a moment, processing the information. Jonathan. Finally, a name for the man who had destroyed her confidence. But the fact that he was married also added a new layer of complexity to the situation. It wasn't just the betrayal that hurt him, it was the fact that there were more lives involved, more people who, like him, were being destroyed by Sarah and Jonathan's actions. "Is he married?" Mark repeated in disbelief. "So there's someone else in this story besides the two of us. Another woman, who is being deceived, just like me." Sarah nodded slowly, tears streaming down her face. His wife doesn't know anything, she said, her voice breaking. He promised to break up with her, promised he would stay with me. But I know it's wrong. I know this was all a mistake. Please, Mark. I'm so sorry. But the apologies felt hollow to Mark. There was nothing she could say to undo the damage that had already been done. He pushed himself away from the bed, trying to control the anger that was rising in waves. You destroyed everything, he said in a whisper. Everything we built, all the years we spent together. And why? By a man who didn't even have the decency to be honest with his own wife. Sarah sobbed, covering her face with her hands. She knew he was right. He knew that he had lost control and that now there was no way to save what they had. I'll talk to her, Mark said suddenly. His wife. She deserves to know the truth, just like I did. Sarah looked up, surprised by Mark's determination. No. Please don't do this, she begged. This will only make things worse. She has nothing to do with this, Mark. Leave her out of it. Leave it out of it? He retorted, furious. She's as involved as we are. And she deserves to know that her husband is a cheater, just like you. Before Sarah could say anything else, Mark's cell phone vibrated in his pocket. He picked it up, looking at the screen, and his heart almost stopped when he saw the sender's name. It was Jonathan's wife. A simple message, but one that would change everything. We need to talk. Mark stood frozen for a moment, not knowing how to react. Sarah watched him with wide eyes, realizing what that meant. Jonathan's wife knew. She had found out, and now she wanted to talk to him. What did she know? How had she found out? It's her, isn't it? Asked Sarah, her voice almost a whisper. Mark just nodded, still processing what that meant. The truth he wanted so much was about to be revealed. And when it was, nothing would be the same. With his cell phone still in his hand, Mark looked at Sarah, his eyes filled with deep pain. I'll find out everything now, he said, with cold determination in his voice. And you will have to live with the consequences of what you did. Sarah tried to say something, but the words died in her throat. Mark left the room, leaving her alone, wrapped in her own tears and regret. He knew he was about to enter even darker territory, but there was no turning back now. Mark walked down the stairs, his heart still racing. Jonathan's wife's message weighed heavy in his hands like a sentence that everything he knew was about to turn into a new nightmare. Things had spiraled out of control long before he even realized it, and now, the truth, the whole truth, was just a thread away from being exposed. He felt the ground cold beneath his feet, but his mind was warm, buzzing with thoughts, conflicting emotions, and an anger he could no longer contain. Jonathan's wife wanted to talk to him. But why? How had she found out? He felt like he was on the verge of a revelation that could change the course of his life forever, but he also knew he wasn't ready to face the entirety of it yet. It wasn't just about Sarah's betrayal, but about what came after. The moral dilemma that now haunted him was suffocating. He had in his hands the power to destroy not only his marriage, but someone else's. Another woman, who was probably just as lost as he was, about to be consumed by the pain of a devastating discovery. Mark walked out of the house, feeling the cool morning air hit his face. His head was spinning, a mixture of guilt, revenge and deep sadness. He looked at his cell phone again, hesitating. He could just ignore the message, avoid all the chaos he knew was about to come crashing down on them. But, at the same time, there was something inside him that pushed him to move forward, to discover what she knew and, more than that, expose the whole truth. He typed a quick, short reply, "We can meet up." Sent it without thinking too much. I knew that once I sent the message, there would be no going back. Jonathan and Sarah had destroyed the trust in their own marriages, and now he and Jonathan's wife were connected by this betrayal, in a way neither of them had asked for or wanted. While waiting for the answer, Mark got into his car and drove aimlessly, just to keep his mind occupied. He knew that meeting Jonathan's wife wasn't just a simple conversation. It was the beginning of something much bigger, a decision that could destroy more lives. And that was what tormented him. Were you willing to reveal everything? Was he prepared to be responsible for exposing a truth that, until now, only he knew? The cell phone vibrated in the passenger seat. The answer came quickly, "I'll meet you at the park in an hour." Simple, direct. Mark stopped the car on the side of a quiet street and stood there, looking out the window, trying to process everything. The park. A public, safe place. It was obvious that she was also trying to protect herself, just like he was. There were no guarantees how this encounter would end, and Mark felt he was entering dangerous territory. When he arrived at the park, a light drizzle began to fall, leaving the ground damp and the air heavy. He walked towards the agreed location, his hands shaking slightly. From afar, he saw a woman sitting on one of the benches under a tree. She looked nervous but determined. Dressed simply, her hair tied up, her face pale. When Mark approached, she looked up, and their eyes met for the first time. "Mark?" she asked, without getting up. "Yes," he replied, stopping in front of her, not knowing exactly how to start the conversation. She gestured to the empty space next to her on the bench, and Mark sat down slowly, feeling the weight of the moment. "I'm Rachel," she said, breaking the silence. "I think you already know why I'm here." Mark nodded, the lump in his throat tightening even more. There was no longer any way to avoid the truth. "Sarah and Jonathan," he began, but couldn't finish the sentence. The reality of everything seemed overwhelming at that moment. Rachel looked at him with a hard expression, but there was a weariness in her eyes that indicated she had known for some time. She sighed and ran her hands through her hair, visibly frustrated. "I found out a few weeks ago," Rachel said finally. "I saw the messages on his cell phone. The lies, the excuses, everything fell into place. I just didn't know what to do with it. I didn't know if I should tell you." His voice was controlled, but carried a deep sadness. Mark felt a surge of empathy for her. They were in the same boat, dealing with the same pain, the same betrayal that had been eating away at their lives. He took a deep breath, trying to organize his thoughts, but nothing seemed to make sense. "I also discovered it recently," he confessed, his voice low. "And since then, I can't stop thinking about what to do. Part of me wants to destroy everything, tell everyone, expose the truth. But another part of me," he stopped, not knowing how to continue. Rachel watched him carefully, her eyes reflecting the same confusion he felt. She pursed her lips thoughtfully. "I've already confronted Jonathan," she said suddenly. "He admitted it. He said he was going to end everything, that he was going to leave her, but I know those are just empty promises. He won't change. Men like him never change." Rachel's words were bitter, but they carried a truth that Mark couldn't ignore. He knew that kind of man, the kind that never really took on his responsibilities. Jonathan had destroyed not only his own marriage, but Mark's as well, without any regard for the consequences. "And what do you want to do now?" asked Mark, breaking the silence that followed. Rachel looked at him for a long moment, her eyes filled with cold determination. "I want justice," she said, without hesitation. "They can't get away with this. They can't just carry on with their lives as if nothing had happened. Jonathan needs to pay. And I think Sarah does too." Mark felt the weight of those words. Justice. Revenge. They were things he also wanted, but he knew the line between the two was thin. He also wanted them to pay for their lies, for destroying everything he had built with Sarah. But at the same time, there was something deeper there. Something that made him question how far he was willing to go. "And how do you intend to do that?" he asked, feeling the tension in the air increase. Rachel glanced at the horizon, where the drizzle continued to fall gently over the park. She seemed to be pondering her next words. "I don't know yet," he admitted. But I know I won't let this go. They deceived us, they betrayed us, and now they have to deal with the consequences. We both deserve better. Mark nodded, but within him, doubt continued to grow. He knew this moment was crucial. He could ally with Rachel and destroy Jonathan and Sarah completely, or he could try to find another solution, something that perhaps wouldn't be as destructive but wouldn't leave him hostage to revenge either. The truth was that he was trapped in a moral dilemma. The betrayal had exposed the worst parts of Sarah and Jonathan, but it was also bringing out the darkest feelings within him. Justice or revenge? And how far would he be willing to go to satisfy this need for reparation? These questions echoed in his mind as he looked at Rachel, both of them silent, waiting for the next move. Mark and Rachel said goodbye in the park without any final decision on how they would act, but they both knew that the meeting had been a turning point. In the days that followed, Mark found himself reflecting deeply on the path he wanted to take. The temptation of revenge still appealed to him, but something inside him began to question whether complete destruction was what he truly wanted. He had already lost so much, his trust in Sarah, the stability of his marriage, and now, the very idea of who he was being eroded by betrayal. Sarah, on the other hand, was increasingly tense, aware that Mark's silence wouldn't last forever. She tried in vain to keep up appearances, but the guilt and fear of being exposed to more people consumed her. The tension in the house was almost palpable, and Sarah knew it was only a matter of time before Mark made a decision. Meanwhile, Jonathan also felt the pressure building. Rachel had distanced herself from him, barely speaking at home, and the coldness with which she treated him indicated that she already knew more than he had imagined. With each passing day, Jonathan sank deeper into uncertainty. He didn't know how to get around the situation, and the fact that Rachel didn't confront him directly made him even more uneasy. He knew something big was coming, something he couldn't control. It was then that the unthinkable happened. Mark was coming home from work, and before entering the house, he checked his cell phone. A new message from Rachel flashed on the screen. "We need to meet." Jonathan found out. Wasting no time, he got in the car again and drove to the place Rachel had indicated, a secluded cafe in a quieter neighborhood. His heart was beating fast, he knew the outcome of that story was about to unfold. When he arrived, Rachel was already sitting at a table in the back, nervous. His eyes were swollen from crying. Mark walked over and sat silently, waiting for her to begin. "He found out we met," Rachel said bluntly. "Jonathan came after me, questioning why I was looking for you. He freaked out, Mark. And now he's threatening to expose everything, but in a way that could hurt us even more." Mark took a deep breath. He knew Jonathan was unpredictable, but he didn't expect the situation to escalate so quickly. "What does he want?" asked Mark, with a mix of anger and frustration. Rachel looked at him, even more shaken. "He's afraid of losing everything. The marriage, the job, the reputation. And he said that if the truth comes out, he'll try to drag us down with him, especially you." Mark was silent for a moment, processing the words. Jonathan, instead of owning up to his failures, was now willing to play dirty to protect himself, even if it meant destroying even more lives. "He wants to put you in charge of everything," Rachel continued. "He said he's going to accuse you of having forced the situation, of having manipulated Sarah into cheating. He will turn this into a game of appearances and lies." Mark felt fury rising inside him. It wasn't just Sarah's betrayal that consumed him, but now Jonathan was willing to turn the entire situation into a dirty, no-rules battle. And worst of all, Sarah didn't know anything. She continued to live in that bubble of guilt, not realizing that the man she was involved with was ready to throw her own reputation in the trash to save himself. "I won't let that happen," Mark said, with cold conviction in his voice. Rachel watched him in silence, seeing something different about him. He had reached his limit. There was no more room for hesitation. Betrayal had already destroyed his marriages, but Mark would not allow Jonathan to turn him into the villain of this story. That night, Mark confronted Sarah. Jonathan knows about us, he said, bluntly. Sarah froze, fear evident on her face. He threatened me, Mark continued, without looking away. He said he's going to put all the blame on me, that he's going to turn this into a war of lies. And you, Sarah, will just be a piece in this game, disposable for him. The words hit Sarah like a blow. She tried to speak, but nothing came out. The reality of who Jonathan really was began to dawn on her, like a veil being ripped from her eyes. I didn't know, she stammered, feeling the ground disappear beneath her feet. Of course I didn't know, Mark said, his voice full of frustration. Because you trusted him. You betrayed us both for a man who is now willing to sacrifice you to save his own skin. Sarah collapsed on the sofa, without the strength to react. She was trapped in a nightmare, but now, there was no denying the truth. Jonathan wasn't the man she thought he was. And now, Mark stood before her, no longer angry, but with a calmness that scared her even more. I'm leaving, he said finally. You made your choice, Sarah. Now, I'm doing mine. Mark left the house without looking back, feeling a strange relief come over him. He had decided that he would no longer bear the burden of Jonathan's betrayal, lies, or manipulations. And Sarah? She would have to face the consequences of her actions alone. In the following days, Jonathan tried to manipulate the situation, pitting Rachel against Mark, trying to play the victim. But Rachel was no longer the same. She confronted Jonathan, demanded a divorce, and, with the help of a lawyer, began to dismantle each of his lies. Jonathan, in turn, saw his life slowly fall apart, unable to control the damage he himself had caused. As for Mark, he began to rebuild his life. There was a peace in knowing he was no longer trapped in a relationship based on lies. He had been through the worst, but now, he was free to move on, without the shadow of betrayal hanging over him. Sarah tried to reconnect, tried to apologize, but Mark knew there was no more room for that. The cycle had closed. This was the story of Mark, Sarah, Jonathan and Rachel, a story where betrayal destroyed bonds, but also brought to light the hidden truths behind each mask. Comment below what you thought of the story, which character impacted you the most, and what you would do in their place. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel to hear more stories like this. And remember, this channel does not support any type of betrayal. Here, our fictional stories show how betrayal can destroy lives, homes and trust. Until next time.